My parents handed my boyfriend to my sister. Years later we met again. My name is Renata Voss. I'm 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, my sister called me for the first time in 6 years and asked me to come to her engagement party. The man standing next to her in the photo she sent, smiling, holding her hand, was Caleb Hartwell. The same Caleb my parents took away from me when I was 22. I almost dropped my phone when I saw his face. Before I tell you how that party went, I need to take you back. Back to a small town called Millhaven, where my family ran the only hardware store for 30 miles, and where my mother decided a long time ago that love in our house was something you earned, not something you were given. I was the older daughter. I was the one who did the books at 16 because my dad couldn't add a column of numbers without losing his place. I was the one who showed up on time, who never asked for anything twice, who learned early that being needed was the closest thing to being loved that I was going to get. My sister Paisley was 4 years younger and never had to learn that lesson. She didn't have to ask twice for anything. My mother, Denise, just gave it to her before she finished the sentence. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you need to understand the math before I show you what my family did with it. When I was 19, a young electrician named Caleb Hartwell started coming around the store. He was quiet, careful with his hands, the kind of person who actually listened when you talked instead of waiting for his turn to speak. He taught me how to rewire a lamp on the back counter one slow Tuesday afternoon, and I taught him how to read a profit and loss sheet at the diner 2 nights later. That was us. Lamps and ledgers. It sounds small when I say it out loud, but it was the realest thing I had ever felt. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. No big production, just him on one knee in the gravel parking lot behind the store, holding a ring he'd saved 3 months of overtime to buy. I said yes before he even finished asking. My parents did not say congratulations. My mother looked at the ring, looked at Caleb and said, "Well, he's a sweet boy. But is this really the kind of life you want, Renata?" My father just grunted and went back to his newspaper. I told myself it was nerves. Small town people. They needed time. What I didn't know was that my mother had already started counting something else entirely. Here's what I pieced together years later. But I'll tell you now so you understand what was already moving underneath the surface while I was happily picking out wedding venues. Caleb's family had just come into money. Not lottery money, not flashy money, but real money. A slow-moving inheritance dispute on his late uncle's side that was finally getting settled. Land and oil rights way out past the county line that nobody in Millhaven had paid attention to until the lawyers got involved. My mother paid attention. My mother always paid attention to money the way some people pay attention to weather. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew that summer was that Paisley started showing up everywhere Caleb and I were. At the diner. At the store. At his apartment once with some excuse about needing to borrow a ladder. My mother started inviting him to family dinners without telling me, then acting surprised when I showed up and he was already at the table laughing at one of her jokes. My father started pulling him aside for talks in the garage that lasted way too long for 2 men who supposedly had nothing in common. I noticed. I want you to know that I noticed. I just didn't have a name for what I was noticing yet. Then I had to leave for 3 weeks. I was working a project 2 states over, helping balance the books for a regional supplier my dad's store did business with. It was the kind of trip that builds a career, the kind I couldn't say no to. Caleb told me he'd call every night. He did for the first week. Then the calls got shorter. Then they stopped. I came home on a Sunday to an apartment that wasn't his anymore. His clothes were gone. His phone was disconnected. I stood in that empty hallway with my suitcase still in my hand, and I felt the floor tilt under me in a way I had never felt before, not even close. My mother delivered the news like she was reading off a grocery list. "He realized Paisley was who he really wanted," she said. "It's better this way, Renata. You'll thank us someday. You'll thank us someday." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second because I had to sit with it for 6 years. I didn't understand it then. I thought maybe Caleb had just fallen out of love with me the way people sometimes do. I cried in my childhood bedroom for 2 nights, packed a bag, and drove back to my job 2 states away because staying in that house one more day would have broken something in me that I wasn't sure could be put back together. It took almost a year for me to learn the truth, and even then I only got pieces of it. A mutual friend let it slip over coffee that Caleb had been shown screenshots, texts supposedly from me, flirting with someone from my work trip, conversations that never happened, sent from a number that wasn't even mine. Someone had built an entire fake relationship out of thin air and handed it to him as proof that I'd already moved on. By the time he found out the screenshots were fake, Paisley had already moved in close, comforting him, being there every single day while he was hurting, exactly the way my mother had planned it. I left Millhaven for good after that. I took a job 2 states away in municipal finance, the kind of work where every number has to match every other number or the whole thing falls apart. Turned out I was good at it. Really good. The same instinct that made me balance my father's books at 16 made me a natural at tracing money through systems designed to hide it. I didn't go home for holidays. I didn't go home for my grandmother's funeral, which I still regret, but by then I had learned that showing up for my family always cost me something I never got back. Paisley and I spoke maybe twice a year, short and careful, always through her, never through my parents directly. Every conversation had this strange undertone, like she was checking on something, making sure a wound stayed open instead of healing. I built a life, a small apartment that was entirely mine, a career that grew faster than I expected, a handful of relationships that never quite took root because some part of me was still standing in that empty hallway, waiting for an explanation that never came. And then, 6 years later, my phone rang, and it was Paisley's name on the screen for the first time since I couldn't remember when, and her voice was bright and a little too fast, the way it always got when she wanted something. "Renata, I'm engaged," she said. "You have to come. It's time we put the past behind us." I asked who she was engaged to, even though some part of me already knew the answer before she said it. "Caleb," she said. "You remember Caleb?" I stood in my kitchen holding that phone for a long time after she hung up. "I want you to understand something about me before we go any further. I don't get angry the way some people do, loud and fast and over within an hour. My anger moves slow. It collects. It files itself away in folders and waits for the moment it's needed. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet, steady voice told me that the moment had finally come. I said yes to the party. I told her I'd be there. And then I hung up the phone and opened my laptop, because 6 years of training had taught me exactly one thing that was about to matter more than anything else in my life. When something doesn't add up, you don't yell about it. You trace it, dollar by dollar, date by date, until the truth has nowhere left to hide. Act 2. It started with one careless message in a family group chat I wasn't even supposed to be part of anymore. A few months before Paisley's call, a cousin of mine, Tara, had added me back to an old family thread by accident, the kind of group chat nobody really uses except for birthdays and funerals. I almost left it immediately. Then I saw a message buried 3 weeks deep, forwarded from my mother to my aunt, talking about how grateful she was that things worked out the way they were supposed to with Caleb and Paisley. Nothing alarming on its own. Just enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. I'm a forensic accountant. That's not a fancy title I use to sound impressive. It means my entire job is finding the one number that doesn't belong, the one transaction that doesn't match its story. I have spent years tracing fraud through municipal contracts, finding the exact moment a clean set of books turns dirty. I know what it looks like when someone is hiding something, even in something as small as a text message. So I did what I do for a living. I started pulling threads. The first thing I found wasn't even hard. I was working late one night on an unrelated audit for a city contract 2 counties over, cross-referencing electrical subcontractors for a public works project, and Caleb's company name came up. Hartwell Electrical. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long minute. He'd built something real. A growing business, steady contracts, the kind of trajectory that made you proud even when it hurt to feel proud of someone who wasn't yours anymore. But it was the second thing that made my stomach drop. Right below Hartwell Electrical on that contract list was an investment group with my father's name listed as a minor partner. Walter Voss. My father, who had spent his whole life behind the counter of a hardware store, had quietly bought into commercial real estate ventures that were now winning bids alongside Caleb's company. The timing wasn't subtle once I lined it up. It started the same year Caleb and Paisley got together. I told myself it could be coincidence. I am, by training, the kind of person who does not believe in coincidence, but I needed one more night to be sure before I let myself believe what I was starting to see. That's when Tara, the same cousin who'd accidentally added me to the group chat, forwarded me something else without realizing what she was handing me. It was an old email chain from years back, The kind that gets passed around during a family reunion when somebody's cleaning out a shared drive. Buried in it was a message from my mother to Paisley, dated almost 2 months before Caleb proposed to me. The subject line said, "Caleb's situation." I read it 3 times to make sure I understood what I was looking at. My mother had written that Caleb's family was about to come into serious money from the uncle's estate, that it would be a waste for that kind of opportunity to end up with someone as naive with money as me, and that Paisley needed to start redirecting his attention before things go further. Redirecting his attention before things go further. My engagement hadn't even happened yet, and my mother was already planning how to take it apart. I sat at my kitchen table that night with my laptop open, and felt something inside me go very still and very quiet. Not sad. Sad would come later in smaller doses at strange times, like when I passed a hardware store or heard someone humming a song Caleb used to whistle. What I felt that night was clarity. The kind of clarity you get when a column of numbers that never match suddenly does, all at once, and you realize the mistake wasn't a mistake at all. It was a choice. I spent the next several weeks doing what I do best. I pulled property records on my parents' house and found a second mortgage taken out the same year Paisley's engagement to Caleb supposedly happened, naturally. I pulled business filings on the investment group my father had quietly joined and found Caleb's company listed as a recurring contractor on 3 separate projects. I went back through old text exports I had saved without ever knowing why, the same trained instinct that makes me back up every file I touch, and found message threads with numbers I didn't recognize. Numbers that matched burner phones registered the same month Caleb and I broke up. It wasn't one big smoking gun. It was 100 small ones lined up end to end, the same way fraud always looks once you finally see the whole picture instead of one piece at a time. My mother hadn't just disliked Caleb at first. She had decided calmly and far in advance that he was worth more to this family married to Paisley than married to me, because Paisley was easier to manage, easier to direct, easier to use as a tool to get close to money that was about to start flowing. And when the moment came, she didn't ask me to step aside. She simply removed me the way you remove a number that's throwing off your total. I thought about calling Caleb directly. I thought about sending him everything I'd found, dropping it on him before the party, letting him decide what to do with 6 years of his life rebuilt on a lie. I decided against it. Not because I was being kind, because I needed him to see it the way I had in person without time to talk himself out of believing it. I thought about confronting my parents over the phone, the way any normal person might, screaming the truth into a receiver until somebody admitted something. I decided against that too. I had learned a long time ago, both in my career and in my own house, that people like my mother do not crack under noise. They crack under proof presented calmly, in a room they cannot control. So I built my case the way I build every case. Slowly, quietly, completely. I printed the email chain. I printed the property records. I printed the business filings showing my father's investment group and Caleb's company appearing together project after project. I printed bank statements showing the timeline of that second mortgage lining up almost exactly with the month my engagement to Caleb fell apart. I put it all in a single folder, the kind I use for every audit I have ever closed, labeled simply with a date and a name. I did not write anything dramatic on the cover. I never do. The numbers speak loud enough on their own once somebody finally sits down and reads them. 3 days before the party, Paisley called again, this time just to check that I was actually coming. Her voice doing that thing it always did when she was nervous and trying to hide it. "It's going to be so good to have the whole family together," she said. "Mom's been so excited." I told her I wouldn't miss it for anything. I meant that more than she understood. The drive back to Millhaven took almost 6 hours, and I spent most of it running through every version of how the evening might go. I imagined Caleb seeing me across the room and feeling nothing. I imagined my mother's face when she saw the folder sitting in my bag. I imagined a dozen ways this could fall apart before I even got the chance to lay one document on a table. None of those imagined versions prepared me for what it actually felt like to drive past the old hardware store. Still standing exactly where it always had, the paint a little more faded. The same bell above the door I used to hear every single day of my childhood. My parents' house looked unchanged too. The same porch swing. The same crack in the driveway that nobody had ever fixed. It was strange, walking up to a house that looked frozen in time when I knew now that everything inside it had been quietly rearranged behind my back for 6 years. I parked across the street instead of in the driveway. I sat in my car for a long minute with the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, the same way you sit outside a building right before you walk in to deliver news you know is going to change the temperature of the entire room. I thought about the day Caleb taught me to rewire that lamp, how careful his hands were, how he double-checked everything twice before he ever flipped the switch. I understood sitting there that I was about to do the exact same thing. Check everything twice. Then flip the switch. I picked up the folder, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the sound of my family's laughter spilling out through the open windows of a house that had never once, not in 31 years, told me the whole truth about anything. The first thing I noticed pulling into Millhaven was how small everything looked. The grain silo by the highway, the bell tower on the Baptist church, the hardware store with my father's name still painted on the window in letters I used to trace with my finger as a kid. 6 years away had made the town shrink, but my chest still tightened the second I crossed the county line, like my body remembered something my mind had tried hard to forget. I parked 2 houses down from my parents' place because I wasn't ready yet to walk up that driveway. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and a leather folder on the passenger seat, the same folder I'd built piece by piece for the last 8 months. Bank records, old emails, a printed text thread my cousin had forwarded without knowing what she was holding. I wasn't bringing a bomb into that party. I was bringing a mirror. The difference matters, and I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened next. The house was strung with string lights and paper banners that said "Congratulations Paisley" and "Caleb" in gold cursive. Through the window I could see them before I even reached the porch. My mother in a blue dress, laughing too loud at something. My father by the grill, looking older, smaller, like the years had finally caught up to the man who once filled every doorway he stood in. And then I saw him. Caleb was standing near the dessert table in a gray button-down, holding a glass of sparkling cider instead of champagne, the way he always did at things like this because his stomach never agreed with the bubbles. Some habits don't change even when everything else does. He looked up and for one full second, our eyes met across that crowded yard, and I watched the color drain right out of his face. Paisley grabbed his arm before he could say anything. "Renata!" she squealed. Like we were old friends instead of 2 sisters who hadn't shared a real conversation in 6 years. "You came. I'm so glad you came." I smiled. I'd practiced that smile in the rearview mirror the whole drive down. "Wouldn't miss it," I said, and I meant that in a way she didn't understand yet. My mother swept in next, kissing both my cheeks like nothing had ever happened, like she hadn't once stood in her own kitchen and told me a man I loved had simply decided he wanted someone else. "You look wonderful," she said. "Successful. We're so proud of you." Pride from a woman who'd spent 22 years making sure I never felt like enough. The party moved around me in waves I'd already memorized the shape of. Aunt Cora telling the same story about her knee surgery. Uncle Russ asking if I was still doing that numbers thing. My father avoiding me entirely, busying himself at the grill, flipping burgers he didn't need to flip. I watched Caleb from across the yard for almost an hour, watched him laugh at things that didn't seem funny to him, watched him glance toward me 3 times and look away each time like he'd been burned. The toasts came after dinner. My father stood with a glass in his hand and talked about family, about how blessed they were to watch Paisley find exactly the right man. Every word landed on me like a small, deliberate stone. I clapped along with everyone else. I am very good, it turns out, at clapping along with things that are breaking me on the inside. It's a skill you build when you spend your whole childhood learning that your feelings come second to everyone else's comfort. My mother found me near the drink table afterward. Her voice dropped low and sweet, the voice she used when she wanted something to sound like kindness instead of control. "You should be happy for your sister," she said. "Everything worked out exactly as it should have." I looked at her for a long moment. "Did it, Mom?" Something flickered behind her eyes, gone before I could name it. "Don't start," she said, and walked away before I could answer. That was when I made my decision. Not to confront her in front of everyone. Not yet. I wanted 5 minutes alone with Caleb first, because whatever happened next, he deserved to hear the truth from me before he heard a version of it from anyone else. I found him near the side gate, away from the lights, checking his phone like a man looking for an excuse to leave. "Can we talk?" I asked. "Just for a few minutes." He hesitated, glanced back toward the party, then nodded once. We walked to the edge of the yard. Past the old oak tree where he'd once carved our initials into the bark with a pocket knife when we were 20 and stupid and certain nothing could touch us. I didn't know you'd be here, he said. Paisley said it was just family. I am family, I said. Or I used to be. He looked down at his shoes. Renata, what happened back then? I need you to know I didn't just walk away. I thought you'd. He stopped. I thought you cheated. Your mom showed me messages. Screenshots. She said you'd been seeing someone in the city, that you basically moved on before you even told me. My stomach dropped even though some part of me had already guessed this. There were no messages, Caleb. There was no one else. There was never anyone else. I know that now, he said quietly. I didn't know it then. I was 22 and scared, and your whole family was telling me the same story from different mouths. Paisley kept showing up. Your mom kept talking. Eventually it just felt true because everyone around me agreed on it. I opened the folder. I didn't slam it down dramatically. I just opened it the way I open files at work when a client needs to see exactly what happened to their money. I showed him the email my mother had sent Paisley over 6 years ago, the one our cousin had forwarded without realizing what she was passing along. We need to redirect his attention before the engagement becomes official. It has to look natural. I showed him the timeline I'd built. Dates lining up with his family's sudden inheritance, with my father's business filings, with quiet investments that trace straight back to contracts Caleb's growing company had been winning ever since. His hands were shaking by the time he reached the 3rd page. This is impossible, he said, but his voice had already started to crack at the edges, the way voices do right before someone stops believing their own denial. It's possible, I said. It's documented. I'm an accountant, Caleb. I don't build stories. I trace numbers back to where they started, and these numbers started the same week you and I got engaged. He sat down hard on the low stone wall bordering the garden, the folder open across his knees, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and the anger in them wasn't pointed at me. They used me, he said. They used both of us. Yes. I need to see this room differently before I do anything else, he said, standing up slowly, the folder still in his hand. We walked back toward the party together, and I knew the moment we crossed back into the light that whatever was coming, there was no stopping it now. My mother saw the folder first. I watched her face change, watched 20 years of careful performance crumble in under 3 seconds. Caleb, sweetheart, whatever she's told you. Did you fake messages from Renata? He asked her, his voice carrying further than he probably intended, cutting clean through the chatter around the dessert table. Did you tell me she cheated when she didn't? The yard went quiet the way a yard only goes quiet when everyone realizes something real is happening. I was protecting this family, my mother said, her chin lifting in that defensive way I remembered from 100 childhood dinners. You were selling me, Caleb said, to whoever was more profitable. My father set down his spatula. For the first time all night, he looked directly at me. Renata, he started, and something in his voice sounded almost like an apology trying to find its way out after 6 years of silence. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Paisley's wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the patio stones. What is he talking about? She said, looking between our mother and Caleb, her voice climbing toward panic. Mom, what is he talking about? Nobody answered her right away, and in that silence I watched my sister begin to understand, piece by piece, in front of 40 relatives and 2 trays of untouched cake, that her engagement had never really been about love at all. Paisley called me 4 days after the party, and her first words weren't, I'm sorry. They were, you need to fix this. I sat at my kitchen table 2 states away, phone pressed to my ear, watching the steam rise off my coffee, and I let her talk for almost 2 full minutes before I said anything. She told me Caleb had moved out of their shared apartment. She told me relatives were whispering. She told me Mom wasn't speaking to anyone, locked in her bedroom for 3 days straight, and that this was somehow my doing because I'd ruined everything by bringing paper into a party. I didn't break anything, Paisley, I finally said. I just stopped letting it stay broken quietly. She hung up on me. I let her. The days that followed unraveled in pieces, the way these things always do once the first thread gets pulled. My father called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice rougher than I remembered, and told me things I'd already half figured out from the financial records but needed to hear from him directly. He'd used Caleb's growing electrical business as a backdoor into commercial contracts he couldn't get access to on his own. The inheritance dispute Caleb's family had quietly won years ago wasn't a coincidence. My father had been tracking it before Caleb and I were even officially engaged, and once he saw the money attached to that name, he decided his younger daughter, the easier daughter, the one who'd always do what she was told, would be the one to marry into it. "You were never going to let that happen, were you?" I said. It wasn't really a question. "No," he admitted, and for the first time in my entire life, my father sounded ashamed instead of justified. I spent that week doing something I hadn't expected to do. I shared the documentation quietly, not as a weapon, just as a correction. I sent the timeline to my Aunt Cora, who I knew would pass it along the family grapevine faster than any group text ever could. I sent the original email to the cousin who'd accidentally forwarded it in the first place, so she'd know the truth instead of carrying around a guilty half-understanding. I didn't post anything publicly. I didn't make a scene online. I let the facts move at their own pace through people who had spent years believing a version of my life that was never true, and one by one they started reaching out. Some apologized. Most just went quiet, which told me everything I needed to know about who had actually believed my mother's story, and who had simply been too afraid to ask questions. My mother tried, briefly, to rewrite the narrative. She told a few relatives I'd manufactured the documents out of jealousy, that I'd never gotten over Caleb, and this was my way of punishing the family for moving on without me. It might have worked 6 years ago, when I was the quiet daughter nobody bothered to listen closely to. It didn't work now. Bank records don't care how convincingly you cry while denying them, and 3 separate relatives told me, almost word for word, that the dates simply didn't lie the way people do. Caleb reached out the following week. Not asking for anything. Just a short text first, then a longer email a few days later, laying out everything he remembered from those final months we were together. The messages he'd been shown, the conversations Paisley had engineered to run into him, at exactly the right moments, the slow drip of doubt my mother had poured into him one visit at a time until he genuinely believed I'd already left him in his heart before I ever said a word out loud. We met for coffee, careful and quiet, somewhere neutral far from Millhaven. We didn't talk about getting back together. We talked about what had actually happened piece by piece, the way you'd walk through wreckage after a storm to figure out what could still be salvaged and what had to be cleared away for good. "I believed them," he said, turning his cup in slow circles on the table. "That's the part one can't get past. Not that they lied. That I let them." "You were 22 and surrounded by people you trusted," I said. "I don't blame you for that anymore. I used to. I don't now." It took months, not weeks, for anything real to rebuild between us. We started slow. A phone call here, a weekend visit there, no promises, no rushing toward anything we weren't ready for. What mattered most wasn't whether we ended up together again. What mattered was that for the first time in our entire history, nobody else's hands were on the strings. No one was managing the story behind our backs. Whatever grew between us this time would grow because we chose it, not because someone else engineered it for profit. My father reached out one more time near the end of that year, asking if we could meet, just the two of us, somewhere outside the house that held so much of what had gone wrong. We sat in a diner booth on the edge of town, and he apologized in the halting, awkward way men like him apologize when they've spent a lifetime avoiding the word entirely. He told me he'd lost most of the contracts anyway once the scheme came undone, that the business he'd been trying to protect had collapsed under its own dishonesty. He didn't ask me for money. He didn't ask me to fix anything. He just asked if there was any way back into my life, even a small one. I told him the truth. Not full forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever in the way he wanted it. But not exile either. I told him I was willing to build something new slowly with real honesty this time, the same way I was rebuilding things with Caleb. No shortcuts, no performances, no pretending the past hadn't happened. He could earn a place in my life back through years of consistency, the same way trust always has to be earned, the hard way, one true conversation at a time. Paisley and I haven't spoken much since. She's working through her own version of this, somewhere between blaming me and slowly realizing her engagement was never really about her either. I hope someday she finds her way to understanding that the love she thought she had was a transaction wearing a wedding dress. and that the anger she feels toward me is misplaced anger that belongs somewhere else entirely. That's her work to do, not mine. I think about that folder sometimes, sitting in my desk drawer now instead of my passenger seat. I don't need it as a weapon anymore. I keep it because it reminds me of something important, that the people who try hardest to convince you that you imagined your own mistreatment are almost always the ones hiding the most. My mother spent 6 years insisting I'd misunderstood, overreacted, imagined slights that weren't real. The truth was sitting in bank records the whole time, waiting patiently for someone willing to trace it back to where it started. I built a life 2 states away from the people who taught me my love was negotiable. I built a career out of the same instinct that finally set me free, the refusal to look away from a number that didn't add up. And slowly, carefully, on my own terms this time, I'm building something with Caleb that has nothing to do with anyone else's plans for either of us. That's my story. 6 years of silence, 1 engagement party, and a folder that finally told the truth nobody else would. If you've ever been told your own pain wasn't real, trust the version of events you actually lived through. The receipts always catch up eventually,